This is Chris Lee. I'm joined by Blake Lovell as we discuss the news of Thursday afternoon. Not that it wasn't anticipated, but it is now official. Texas and Oklahoma will be joining the Southeastern Conference. Blake, your reaction on that?
Yeah, like you said, we knew it was coming. This was expected. I think the the unanimous vote, as always, very interesting, right?
With the loving arms of Texas A&M included in that, right?
I'm sure there was no kicking and screaming at all from
No.
Texas A&M, not one bit. I'm sure that was a very easy unanimous yay vote. But in all seriousness, I mean, like you said, it completely changes things. And we mentioned this when we talked about it on Monday. This is, I think, just the first layer of things to come with sort of the conference shifting and realignment. And I think probably for the SEC as well. I think there's a lot on the table at this point in terms of what's next. Now, of course, the thing is we have to keep in mind, 2025 is still a good little ways away. So it's going to take some time, but there are things that I think you start to look at and think, boy, there are a lot more dominoes I think that could fall from this. And as we mentioned as well on Monday, I think from a Big 12 standpoint specifically, there are many more dominoes to fall.
It's crazy just given how much is out there and how much speculation. What was it, 8 days ago, the news about this broke for the first time, and I'm still just amazed that everyone is able to keep it that quiet that long. But now there's all kinds of things that I'll get into later. I was on the phone this morning talking with the contact of mine who's really well connected in athletics circles, AD circles, those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, 8 days ago this started, and now it just seems like old news. I just cannot get by how quickly this happened, how fast this became a 14 to nothing vote. I mean, this is just one of these things, and I've said this before on our podcast. Usually things like this have a long buildup. Just the start to finish with this was just unbelievable.
Yeah, it's wild how quickly everything came together here. As you mentioned, also, this is obviously something that's been in the works for quite a while. Would be my guess. I think it's the timeline is always interesting on things like this, knowing that the fact is, as you said, for this to get to the vote as quickly as it did, for everything to go through, and now we're sitting here knowing, as we talk on Thursday afternoon, that Texas and Oklahoma are going to be in the SEC officially, starting with the 2025-26 academic year. That is just it's wild to think about because remember when we started SEC Media Days last week, what's that, 10 days ago at this point? Not even a thought to this. Like not even one single thought was on anyone's mind. We were all let's saying, all right, who's going to be the guy that's sort of the MVP of SEC football media days? Who's going to be the guy that says something crazy, or who's going to impress? And then it's like everything shifted so quickly. Whenever that was Wednesday or Thursday of last week, to where this is where all the conversation started. And from there, we of course had to start speculating. Well, what does this mean beyond Texas and Oklahoma? I still don't think we know the complete answers to that yet. But the fact is, I think we say this all the time, but it's one of those things where I think for Greg Sankey, this is just, I understand the hesitations, and I think this is something we're going to hear about a little bit in terms of, dealing with Texas and Oklahoma. We've heard this before, right? In terms of maybe Texas specifically when it comes to trying to pull the strings and maybe have more power than perhaps being, within the SEC. What does that structure look like, right? And we've heard that, like we said, when it comes to dealing with different schools and different things. And that's the first thing. It's funny, we on one of our things that we uploaded that we were talking about with Texas and Oklahoma earlier in the week, someone had mentioned that, hey, this could be something where you've got Texas and Oklahoma, and could they become a headache? Just given sort of some of the past there, and as we said, the Texas A&M element, you're adding a lot of different dynamics together here. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it works out. But at the end of the day, if you're Greg Sankey, like it's a no-brainer in terms of making that next step towards perhaps eventually, I don't know, like what is the end game here in terms of for the SEC? We know what the end game was for Texas and Oklahoma, but I think that's the most curious thing I have at this stage is to see, all right, Greg Sankey makes this move. Everyone unanimously, we joke about that, but everyone's on board. What's next? And I think that's the big question for me at this point.
I want to get to the what's next, but there are still a few ends I would like to tie up on this. If you want to hear a really good podcast that talks about this from the Oklahoma end, go to rebelgrove.com. That's my friends Neil McCready and Chase Parham, who run that at the Ole Miss Rivals site. They had Kerry Murdoch from Sooner Scoop on. He covers Oklahoma also for the Rivals Network. They had a podcast that was both entertaining and just really interesting. One of the things that Kerry brought up is that Jimbo Fisher was taking the stage almost right when this was breaking. So you have the most bitter opponent of this whole thing, the head coach of that program, taking the stage for media day. I think he made a comment about how much they enjoyed being the only member in the SEC from Texas, something along those lines, right? I don't know the exact word, but the timing of it just with that. Neil also made a comment in that same podcast because the time frame is a few academic years out from now, but I thought Neil put it really well, that it's like that couple that says we're going to divorce, but we're going to hold on through when the kids get to college, and then we'll do it then. How kind of from once the moment you declare the divorce, really it's not got much of a chance to last that long. I thought that was very well put, and there's been some speculation. I don't know that there's anything to it, but that we could see this next year for football season. And frankly, at this point, why not, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing is it's one of those where you can have all this in place, but as we know with any sort of deal and situation, there are ways out of these different deals and contracts and all this other stuff. And I think it's just going to be interesting to see how quickly things come together because the SEC is going to say all the right things about when this could start and the official wording and language and all this other stuff, but it's still going to be something like you said. That's that's something where if you're hanging around for the next whatever 4 years now, the 4 or 5 years, whatever it winds up being at this point, there's just a lot that goes into that, and I think it's there's a lot probably from other schools in the Big 12 that are probably going to be looking around trying to make these moves and figure out what's next for them because it is going to change a lot. And I think that's where we start to talk about, okay, what are the other points where things start breaking off with other conferences and those kind of things. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of how everything unfolds, what the timeline looks like, because as we said, I don't think there's anything just completely set in stone on how this is going to go. And if in fact they're going to be not waiting and starting until 4 or 5 years from now. I think there are a lot of ways around that.
On the other end of this really goes back a few years because I don't know that this all happens if Nebraska and Colorado don't leave the Big 12 back whenever that was. I don't remember how many years ago,
Yeah.
but folks got tired in that league of Texas having its way and those sorts of things. And I think that was always a point of irritation within that league. I think that had a lot to do with why Nebraska left, for instance. But you bring up the point about people getting tired of Texas and those sorts of things. And look, I don't cover the Big 12. You don't either. We are not as close to that as other people are. So I'm just telling you what I have heard and the impressions that I've gathered. But I just think it's much harder for Texas now to be the bully of the league. I don't know if that's a fair term, but you get what I'm trying to express here. I don't know that Texas is going to be able to come around and throw its weight around in the SEC like it could in the Big 12, and I suspect we know the answer to that, and I think it's no.
Yeah, it's going to be a much much tougher challenge, I think, in the SEC. Again, just given the entire landscape and knowing that you're the one that initiated this, right? Like it's not like the SEC, I think, was probably in a situation where, look, I'm sure there's lots of stuff that goes on and back channels and everything, but obviously there was a lot of interest here from Texas, Oklahoma, feeling like this was going to be the right move for them. And yes, like if you're going to make that move, and look, I mean, we know like there's a lot of political stuff and power plays and all this that goes on with some of these things, but if you're going to make this move thinking, all right, we're going to go into the, strongest conference and then really flex our muscles and show that this is where we belong and we're the top dog in there, I think, like you said, there's going to be a little bit more pushback maybe than you would have seen, given, just the landscape of the Big 12. And so much different, I think, situation in the SEC. And I think this is where, from a financial standpoint, if it becomes, one of those scenarios where Texas and Oklahoma want to, try to get out early, get to the SEC as quickly as they can, really get acclimated very quickly rather than, waiting those years. It's going to take a lot of money to do it, but, I mean, it's doable, right? As we always say, like, I think, look at some of the numbers I'm looking at now. I think it's like 72 million, 80 million, something like that, in terms of what Oklahoma could owe to have to leave early and come to the SEC. But we know, like, if Texas, I think, wants this to happen, if Oklahoma wants this to happen rather quickly, I think the money will be found to do that. And then, like you said, it's just a matter of seeing where do they, like we've talked about it from a football aspect, but we really talked about it from all three sports. You can find some of our other stuff we've done. You can just look at our YouTube channel to find that. But I think that, from where do they fall into that, like you said, sort of the pecking order when it comes to what is going to be possible for them. And I think that's what's going to be interesting once they are officially into the conference and things have, you start to have a lot more familiarity, not just looking at it from now until they arrive, but once they actually get into the SEC competition and all those things. What are those relationships like with Texas A&M and Missouri and all the ones like that? And I think that's going to be one of the fascinating parts.
Well, let's rewind a bit, and I promise you we are going to get to Oklahoma. I know Texas is sort of the dominant storyline in this pair. Obviously, Oklahoma, in terms of football programs, is better right now. But there's a thing that I want to bring up with Texas, a dynamic with the football program, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, especially if Texas is in the SEC right away for the 2022 football season. Let's go back to the 2013 season when Mac Brown had overseen a football program that had gone from consensus top 10, if not top 5, to one that was more like top 15. And so he goes 8-5 in 2013, and then they make a change. They go to Charlie Strong, who has 3 losing seasons there, and then they get Tom Herman, which everybody felt at the time was that home run hire. He goes 7-6, then 10-4, then 8-5, and 7-3, and was dismissed after that last season. Now they circle back with Steve Sarkisian, a hire that a lot of people like. Texas spent a fortune for him. Whether he makes it or not, I don't know. But here's the point I'm getting at, okay? Texas has been in a down cycle for a while now. And that becomes much tougher to climb out of that and get to where Texas wants to be, especially if you come into the league in 2022 where you've got an Alabama program that right now is in an era where it's probably the greatest program in the history of college football. A coach in Nick Saban who has just signed a new deal and will be coaching into the foreseeable future. You've got several other teams that have made the playoffs. You've got Georgia is a national factor every year. You've got Florida has popped back up and become relevant again. And I can go on and on and on. Texas A&M, a team that's on the cusp of the college football playoff. And basically almost every program in the league is respectable. And even the ones who aren't, you look at Kentucky, traditionally has not been one of the better programs in the league, but now that team is competitive and going to New Year's Day bowls. And even as bad as Vanderbilt is right now, that's a program that's had a pair of top 25 finishes within the last 10 years. My point is, and sorry for going a long way to make it, I almost wonder for Texas football if the timeline to join, if next year maybe is not ideal given where that program is and its process of trying to get back where it wants to be, where you come in and you're playing a meat grinder of a schedule. And if you, God help you, if you draw the wrong teams from the other division in a year, and I guess we presume Texas will be in the West. I don't know if Alabama goes there or not, but the point is, just about whoever you play, the schedule is going to be brutal. And for Texas, where it is, starting over with another coach at a time where it's been just pretty mediocre for about a decade now, that is something that I think is going to be interesting to see. Does that help or does that hurt Texas's process and getting back to where it wants to be within the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I think, in the Big 12, there's a lot more of a manageable path, I think, to get there. Because again, yes, you know kind of who the big dogs are in the Big 12, but there's a lot more of those teams that maybe fluctuate a bit more. And then of course you've got some struggling programs near the bottom of that. Meanwhile, if you jump into the SEC, let's take this year for example, even though we know that they're not stepping in this season, but let's say that it did start this season, right? And because this is, I think, going to show you just pretty much the trend that you would see even if we look ahead to next season. Alabama, like Oklahoma too, right? Like Oklahoma's a top two, top three team this season, so you assume that's going to continue. So you look at Alabama, Oklahoma, Georgia, Florida, A&M's a top 10 team this season. That's five right there. And then you just keep going down the line, right? Like you look at, LSU and teams like that are on the way up. I think Ole Miss will be one that's on the way up too. I'm sure there's somebody I've just forgot to name, but that just kind of, I think, like that is a very strong top group. And I think as of right now, right, this season, we would probably put all of those teams ahead of Texas, perhaps, just in a preseason poll. Now, all we have to go on is what we see on paper. That could change once we get to the season, but and some of those programs may take a little bit of a step back next season, may not be as strong. But yeah, like you said, if you're a Texas team that's really starting to say, all right, we have to completely revamp the way we do things in football, and that we are back to, we want to win a national championship every single season. I don't think that goal has ever changed. They just have been much closer than others in certain years. It's a tough challenge, right? And that's what I think. That's why, to me, in the current SEC landscape, that's what makes Alabama even more special, that they've been able to do it given this current, landscape in the SEC, to have that sort of dominant reign that they have, even as strong as it's been. Now you add a Texas, you add an Oklahoma, those are potential, pitfalls along the way. Now, if Texas gets back to where they think they should be and they could be, Oklahoma, as we said, they've been pretty much there for a while now, for the most part. So it's a challenge. And I think, like you said, that's where scheduling is going to come into it. Do we go with the pod system? Do we go with some sort of flex scheduling? Like, how do you do this to where it's going to work out? Because it doesn't matter. I think in any scenario, you're still going to have a very challenging slate. And for Texas and Oklahoma, you're going to have a more challenging slate in the SEC conference-wise than you had in the Big 12, and I don't think there's really a debate about that.
Well, let's talk Oklahoma for a minute, Blake, because this is a program that in 2016, Bob Stoops steps down. It doesn't seem like it's been that long. And Lincoln Riley has picked up in Oklahoma in 5 years under him, 4 complete. This will be the 5th. Has not lost more than 2 games. In fact, it's lost exactly 2 in every season. This is a program that has produced a couple of Heisman Trophy quarterbacks under his watch. I would say it's probably I don't know if it's a consensus top 5 program in the country right now, but it's right on that cusp of about the 5 or 6 top programs in the country, and you can rank Oklahoma 6th or 4th, whatever. My point is, after you get past Alabama, it's in that next group of schools that you mentioned within the next breath you draw. That's a program with a young coach. It is playing a lot of offense. That attracts star quarterbacks. Guys want to get to the league. Their guys are getting taken into the league and becoming number 1 picks and all those things. And so this is a train that's headed in a different direction. You might say a schooner headed in a different direction. This one's with a pretty heavy motor in this case. But what I'm trying to say is Lincoln Riley's got that program headed in a great direction. And so whatever issues Texas has in that regard, I don't know that Oklahoma is going to have the same right now.
No, as long as Lincoln Riley's there and let's say doesn't take an NFL job, because I think he's going to be in the mix probably each offseason now, just based on what he's done and given the fact that we know like that's what the NFL's moved towards. You have the Sean McVays and guys like that who are kind of just innovative offensive minds that really, that's what the NFL wants right now in terms of pushing forward offensively, because you see kind of the evolution of the game at that level, but it starts at the college level, and that's where I think you have someone like Lincoln Riley who's been able to prove what he can do. Certainly there, at Oklahoma, and I think as long as he's there, they're to me, and I'm not making the direct comparison, but like they are like sort of like a Clemson, and maybe there's a couple other programs you put in there and say like you just don't really ever expect them. Ohio State's probably in that category. Like you don't really ever expect to go into a new season and them not to be, in the top 5, 7, somewhere in there. Like it's just that's the way it's been, and I think that that's probably going to continue to be that way. But like you said, it's just it's an adjustment too to where does that change anything when you go into the SEC? I think that there probably is much more fluctuation perhaps when you're competing against adding the Georgias and the Floridas and the LSUs and teams like that, Texas A&M. I don't want to keep them out because it's kind of interesting that A&M is just this could be a season where they just kind of have a special season, and maybe that springboards Jimbo to have even more success there moving forward. But I think it's just how does that change, because we always like there's always an adjustment, right? No matter how good you are, or in certain situations, like anytime you change a conference, I think that's such a significant change that there's probably going to be an adjustment period for both of these schools, for Texas and Oklahoma, no matter how talented they are, because it's new opponents, it's getting that familiarity that you can certainly see on tape and all these other things, but that's where if you're already in the SEC, you've been on the field with these teams a lot, and you've seen the dynamic in the league, and there's a lot of things you can learn from that. So still, I think Oklahoma, again, if we looked ahead to next season and said, all right, what are the expectations, let's say for Oklahoma and Texas next season, I don't think there's any doubt that you would put Oklahoma ahead in that race, and you would probably put them right up there and say, all right, beyond Alabama, because at this point you just assume Alabama's going to be at the top, if not 1, 2, or 3, somewhere in that range. And nationally, not the SEC. You just assume Alabama's going to be the best team in the SEC at this point, like it or not. I think Oklahoma's right there in that next tier, and I think, as we talked about, Texas is probably still has some things to prove to whether they can get there and kind of stay in that tier once they make that switch.
Well, this is where I think it gets interesting for both teams, because what's the knock on Big 12 football? What has it been for years, Blake?
Yeah, not a lot of defense.
Not a lot of defense. Now, Oklahoma has gotten better there, but now look, the Big 12, you got to give that league credit. It has been ahead of the curve in terms of offense, further back than the SEC has, right? In other words, the Big 12 figured out the passing game and all these things that are putting up crazy numbers was the way to go. Well, the SEC, which is more a traditional running league, was maybe a little slower to the party. Now I think it's catching up pretty quickly. You've got what Lane Kiffin is doing.
Yeah.
You've seen A&M do it a little bit. Yeah.
What about Leach? What do you think he thinks about all this? That's what I would like to know. I'd like to get a quote from him.
Mike Leach might be going, hey, now I've got a little bit of a defense now that I'm in the SEC and had a couple of years to recruit to it. But the point is, stylistically, it's going to be interesting because now you've got Nick Saban. Like Alabama, for the first time, maybe ever, you could say definitively, was an offense-first program a year ago. It's interesting the timing of this now with the evolution of offenses, and some might say the de-evolution of defenses in recent years, that this is the timing of this whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, the SEC it's funny. You try to think of the timeline, I guess, but that's all we talked about for years was how, boy, it's really hard to play an SEC team because you're not going to be able to score against them. And, you might play some low scoring games, but you're just good luck trying to find points. But now it's like, you don't play an SEC team, some of these, because it's like they're going to put up 50 on you, and it's third quarter. And I think, like I said, Alabama, just a historic season last year. You mentioned it. I mean, I think Ole Miss, they've got a Heisman Trophy potential quarterback this season. If everything goes for them, if they win a lot of games with Lane Kiffin. Leach, we said, Mississippi State certainly had some ups and downs the first season, but I think that wasn't under normal circumstances. Then you look everywhere else. We know what Dan Mullen's done at Florida. Jimbo, like we said, obviously they're going to have to answer some questions at quarterback this year, but still, you expect them to score points. And of course, you say the same thing for a lot of these other teams. Georgia and LSU will have to figure some things out to probably get back to where they want to be in that category. But it's just it is a grind from a defensive standpoint now, and it's you gotta look at it and say it's almost much different than probably if we'd had this conversation, I don't know, 5 years ago. Maybe we're talking much different about sort of the strategic elements that come along with, let's say, a Texas and Oklahoma joining. But now it's like there's a lot of these teams that have really embraced the offense first. And, but the thing is, too, like we say that, but there are also some of these teams that still have defenses that, probably sport 3, 4, 5 guys who are going to play at the end of the NFL. And I think, there's still a lot of talent on that side of the ball, but it's just that offensive have certainly evolved probably over the past, I don't even know what the timeline would be, but there's no doubt that the offenses have gotten better. And like you said, for Big 12 teams that are used to playing in a conference where a lot of points have been scored here as of late, it would be an interesting transition for sure.
Well, my theory for a while, and this is not novel, right? But my thing has always been I'm more interested in knowing the name of your head coach than I am the name on your jersey. And not that that is a perfect analogy. Obviously, on both ends of the spectrum, it can break down. You could put Nick Saban at one of the worst schools in the country, and it might not work. Conversely, you also have seen some guys at Alabama who were just okay, or sometimes once in a blue moon less than okay. But the point is, I think a coach in college sports is the most valuable commodity you can have. And with that, I want to shift to basketball because look at the backdrop of the league right now. Okay. You have got an SEC that's been mediocre for the better part of the last decade. Kentucky and Florida have carried it for a while, more Kentucky recently than Florida, but even that has faded. And the league has made a concerted effort, Blake, to be more competitive in basketball. It started with before Greg Sankey, with Mike Slive. And so this has been an effort that's been in the public eye, that's been noted for a long time. Even if it's been a little bit slower to arrive, you started to see the first fruits of that last year. I think with what Arkansas and Alabama did in particular, and what Tennessee has done in recent years too. But this is where I want to transition into basketball and go back to Texas for a minute, okay? If you were trying to pick a head coach for your program, say back in the spring, and you could have any head coach in the country, given age and track record and all those things, like who would be your number one pick for the guy you would take?
I mean, you can obviously do much worse than Chris Beard, right?
Bingo.
It's just that is a fascinating thing because we just talked about football, right? And the transition. If Texas walked into the SEC now, or specifically like I feel like next season would actually maybe even be better for them, which, like we said, that would be the earliest they could do it. But I think like they could walk in and be one of the favorites to win the SEC in basketball, I would think. And think about this too. And I know we'll probably get to this in a second, but think about what the stat I've always gone back to over the past couple of years is look at how many SEC coaches have led teams to a Final Four. Let's go down the roster quickly. Bruce Pearl, Final Four. Tom Crean, Final Four. Calipari, Final Four. Howland, Final Four. Frank Martin, Final Four. Rick Barnes, Final Four. Now, Chris Beard, Final Four. Porter Moser, Final Four. Right? Like you're adding 2 more coaches that have now led teams to the Final Four. And I think by my count, that would mean that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you would have half the conference that has led teams to Final Fours whenever these 2 join. So it's just like that's crazy. So it's something.
Not to mention you get Rick Barnes squaring off against his old program.
Which he'll get to do this season too. How about that? How about he gets to go back to Texas this season knowing that Texas is going to eventually perhaps join the SEC next season. That's something. So
hey, what do we call the SEC Big 12 Challenge?
That's going to be a good point. I think it's like, are we just going to call the SEC Big 12 Challenge like whoever plays Texas and Oklahoma? Like, I don't know. Is every game going to be SEC? I'm not sure what would happen in that scenario, but it's still a fascinating thing when you look at it from an SEC coaching roster, because all we talked about is how strong it is, and I think you can make the argument it's as strong as it's been perhaps ever from top to bottom. But my goodness, you're going to add 2 guys who have both been in the Final Four in the past 3 years. It's insane. So
fortunately, that won't be awkward at all when SEC teams go on the road to play in that.
No, not at all. So, my goodness, yeah, what an interesting setup that's going to be. So,
well, how lucky must Chris Beard feel today? Because I don't know how easy leaving Tech was for for Texas, he'd done some great things at Tech, as we all know. He's got family there. I think he's got a kid situation, a custody situation, or something like that. But my point is, what if you're Chris Beard and you know an angel comes down from heaven and says, "Hey, by the way, Chris, take that job right now because 4 months from now, Texas Tech is going to be in a conference that's in the middle of dissolving." I mean, just think about that from Chris Beard's standpoint. Of all the people that have had to feel weird about things in the last week or two, think about that dynamic. He leaves one program in the Big 12 for another in the Big 12, and now one is changing conferences, and the other is stuck in the middle of one that's falling apart.
Yeah, that's called career advancement, I think, there in terms of yeah. I mean, like we said, I think we always knew he was going to take that job if it was available, but now it's like there's such a different dynamic to it based on what's probably to come. Like we said, I mean, because that's the thing, right? And we'll have more time, I think, to go through this and kind of sort this out. But it's like, what happens to Texas Tech? What happens to some of these other teams like Baylor and Kansas State and all, like, what's next? And like that to me, of course, we cover the SEC, but I find that just as fascinating as to see, all right, where does Texas Tech go from here? Where do some of those other programs go from here? Like, it's just, yeah, like I think that's still like there's a lot of things that have to be answered on that front. Even though, we're covering the SEC and the rich are getting richer here, but I'm still very curious, like where do things go for Texas Tech and all those other schools? So
Well, the one that I find most interesting, and probably it's just because we're talking basketball right now, is what happens with Kansas, right?
yeah,
Because the football program is arguably the worst in the Power Five, but the basketball program is consistently up there. Now, that comes with some baggage and some bad press.
yeah,
And the Pac 12 has been noted as a potential landing spot, but that's a league I think that probably that and the Big Ten academics are most likely a bigger thing
yeah.
there than they are in the SEC. And so, like, if you're a league president, what does the Kansas brand do for you right now? And maybe it's a moot question, right? Because you've got all this NCAA stuff that Kansas got in trouble for. It's going to go away. So I don't know if people just look at it and roll their eyes and say, well, that was silly, because now a lot of what Kansas was doing, although I understand there were some seedier elements to it, I don't want to gloss over that. But the point is, you're having this come at a time with the change in NCAA rules to the things that used to put schools in the NCAA's jail. Now those are not even going to be frowned upon. Those are going to be encouraged, as a matter of fact, with name, image, and likeness deals, at least in a different form. Point is, Kansas becomes an interesting property given all those things at this point. And I wonder how attractive other leagues are going to find Kansas, because that's not a name that comes up. I mean, you hear the other names, but nobody's going, oh my goodness, let's go clamor to get Kansas before someone else does.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of what they offer, you don't talk about being on completely opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to basketball and football. My goodness. Is there another that you could think of that's probably on that far of an opposite end when it comes to a national brand? I don't know that there is, in terms of football and basketball, because, if you're the Big Ten, right? You're thinking, well, sure, like Kansas joining the Big Ten, that would be a huge get for our basketball and make us even stronger. But then it's like, okay, if you have the perception of Big Ten football and you're like, well, we're about to add perhaps, one of the worst power conference teams in the country. And look, we talk about messes, right? You talk about the basketball, but I mean, football is just, I don't even know I don't even know if mess would be an understatement, probably, given how everything turned out there over the past, whatever year or so. So it's like, I don't know, like what's next for them? And I can't see the Pac-12. Like, I feel like that's just a weird. I feel like Kansas in the Pac-12 just. But I mean, we've said this before, right? Like when it comes to like geographic stuff, I don't know. To me, I don't like it. But I think the Big Ten probably makes more sense. But I don't know. Like it's hard to know. And of course, we talk. There's like Oklahoma State, TCU, ones like that too that we didn't even mention. Iowa State, it's another one. Iowa State, of course, has really become. I mean, they're a perhaps preseason top 10 team in football this season. So there's a lot. This impacts everyone in the Big 12. There's simply no doubt about it. But I think, does that mean all these Big 12 teams are going to stay together? I don't know what could happen with that. So
Okay, well, here's another dynamic that touches on the edge of that. Now, I heard this rumor this morning. We talked about this. We haven't talked about it on a podcast yet, but the hot rumor has been that the ACC and the SEC may engage in some sort of merger, for lack of a better term. And Jay Billis tweets this, and I would presume this is him quoting himself from what he said on ESPN today. I'll read you the quote. This is from Jay Billis's Twitter account. Quote, if I were the SEC and the ACC, I'd merge, and I'd form essentially the NFL and the NBA and have a 32-team conference. You'd essentially only have to play each other, and it would be the dominant force in the college sports landscape. Now, it's interesting to me that I was hearing whispers about this thing this morning, and now you see Jay Billis, who's very tied into the ACC, tweet that out.
What would you think about that? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's the traditionalist in me where I'm just like, is that what we want? I know it doesn't matter what we want.
Well,
no one
wait,
cares.
hang on
But
a minute. That horse is out of the barn and has crossed the county line already, right? So
Yeah.
now it is
16 though is completely different from 32, and I'm like, I don't know. But I get it. Like, I understand it from a business standpoint. I completely understand.
Here's where it gets interesting, okay? You have the college football playoff expanding, and now you're going to have to go to subdivide all these teams, right? And you could have maybe a 4-pod system. You could have 8-team divisions. You could have one in the ACC, one in the SEC, or excuse me, leagues there with 8-team divisions. But the point is, okay, let's say you go to the pod system, which has been discussed, right? And then all of a sudden you have 8 pods between those 2 leagues. Maybe each one gets a bid into the playoffs. I don't know how that works, but I think all of a sudden, if you have sort of a combination of the ACC and the SEC, right? What have been the major gripes, right? You feel like if you're a team that's really struggling and you get the wrong schedule on the wrong year, then you're buried before the season starts. Now, maybe with some realignment in pods or divisions or whatever that is, perhaps you're for Kentucky trying to take your program to the next level. In some way, the pod system perhaps gives you a better chance to do that if the alignment's done correctly. Geography is also the other thing. Maybe there is some synchronicity there between the 2 leagues to, I don't know, geographically realign and perhaps cut down the travel times and all those things. I feel like I'm sort of spitting into the dark here, but it is interesting that you have 2 leagues on the same side of the country discussing this at the time where we're talking pods and expanding the college football playoff and all those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, you're not the only one that's probably been trying to say, all right, you could go this way, you could go that way, or the other way. There's a lot of different, I think, directions you can go with this, and that's going to be the biggest thing, right? We've talked about all of this, but I think that the scheduling and the divisions or the pods or however that ultimately winds up, whether, again, we're talking about just in the 16 team sense or eventually a 32 team sense, that is going to, I mean, that's going to mean everything for certain schools and certain sports. Like, we know that. We mentioned a couple of them earlier in the week, for teams, let's say, that have struggled or in pretty rough spots in terms of, let's say a Vanderbilt or Arkansas that are trying to kind of claw their way up in football, programs like that. Yeah, it could come down to just as, okay, what does the SEC decide when it comes to where we're going to be slotted and all those other things. So I think that's, I can't imagine, again, if we're talking about not just staying at 16, but going to that 32, I can't imagine what kind of headaches that could produce. But I mean, look, I also, like I said, I was kind of half joking when I was like, maybe I don't want to see this. I don't want to see it kind of go to that professional model where you have a 32 team league or something. But I know this is probably the way of the future now, given the way things are going. And even if, let's say, it doesn't happen immediately, I think you're going to see it happen sooner rather than later. just because there's money to be made. TV partners aren't going to hate it. I'll say that ESPN's not going to hate that at all. And there's a lot of money to be made for everyone. And I think from that standpoint, we're only going to go upward in terms of the numbers, probably in the SEC in terms of the schools.
Well, let me give you a scenario here too, okay? Let's say that you're a Vanderbilt, which is desperately struggling to get its head above water again after an 0-9 season. And Clark Lee's got a tough job. And we talk about Vanderbilt often because if you're new to the show, we both live in the Nashville area. We have covered that program. We know a lot about it. That's a dynamic that is very familiar to us. And so I'm thinking if you're them, okay, you're looking this and you're going, oh my gosh, we could grab Oklahoma and Texas next year for all we know on our schedule. And perhaps that comes at a time where Alabama comes up in the rotation. And this is with Vanderbilt in the East. And I mean, all of a sudden, a coach who is struggling to get his program just back to anything resembling respectability, his job just got a lot tougher today as things stand. But let me throw an ACC SEC agreement at you, and you can see how this changes dynamic. What if, say, you play 7 games against your league or something like that, and then you play 3 quote unquote out of conference games against the ACC? Well, all of a sudden, you might draw a Virginia or a Boston College or somebody like that. I'm not picking on those teams specifically, but those are the teams that when you start to think of the teams that are not traditionally dominant in football and maybe better opportunities for wins playing some of the teams in this league right now,
Yeah.
I do think that an ACC SEC agreement of some sort, if that includes, okay, you are now going to be playing, let's say that they do it like the NFL, okay? Because in the NFL, you're going to play every team every few years. And a 32-team league is what they've got in the NFL. So let's say that you've got your division. I don't think that you're going to see teams playing divisional opponents home and home, right? But you'll see them play, if they're 4-team pods, you'll play everybody in your pod once a year. So that's 3 games of your 12 as it stands now. And then you got your 9 that you do something else with. And I'm presuming you'll play some other teams and some other SEC pods. And then maybe you do it like the AFC and the NFC do, that you've got, you play another division, right? If you're the NFC West, you play the AFC West one particular year. Maybe it is an alignment to where you see that with the SEC and the ACC.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably the only way you could do it. Yeah, you could follow the NFL model, I think, in that sense of scheduling and such. And I was just sitting back and thinking, I was like, what do you think the college football playoff committee would think if, like, you get, let's say, Clemson, right? Because in the ACC, in that scenario, Clemson joins the mix. And it's like you're sitting back thinking, all right, let's say on the regular season schedule, you've got Alabama, Oklahoma, Clemson. Pick one of the other teams that are probably going to be in the top 5 from the SEC: Georgia, Florida, whoever, A&M. And it's like, what happens? Like, if they actually are, let's say, probably the 4 or 5 best teams, and they play each other during the season, they beat up on each other. One team wins, the other win. Like, what do you do? Like, I mean, can you keep some of those teams out? Like, because if you're going to go to whatever, let's say the expansion to 12 or whatever, maybe at this point. Who knows what that would throw into it if you go to 32 conference? Like, who knows how any of that would look? But I'm just thinking, like, my goodness, that would just be a wild scenario. Just to be like, all right, who's going to be the national champion when maybe in all likelihood 4 of those 5 teams that maybe are the best in the country have already played each other once during the season. And it's like, you just play again because they're probably the best teams out there. And it's just, gosh, it's such a wild thing to think about. And knowing that 10 days ago, we weren't even considering a week ago, we weren't even considering any of this.
And meanwhile, the TV networks are sitting there saying, yeah, we're good with that.
Oh, my goodness. Of course they are.
You don't care about all those things.
No.
You like the ratings, and I don't blame him. I mean, I would too. But let me bring up another aspect of that schedule, okay? And this is not an original thought. I've heard some other people express this today. I think the Revel Grove podcast brought this up. But let's say that you're Boston College. You were never going to get Alabama to come to your place and play. If you're Vanderbilt, you're never going to get Clemson to come to your place and play.
Yeah.
Under this scenario, like,
right.
I think we have had the focus all along is, does this bury the bottom teams in the SEC, the ones that are trying to get their heads above water? now this has a chance to do some things for those teams that I don't think we'd really pondered before, because now some powerhouses that might never come in your building under any other circumstance might be mandated to be on your schedule going forward.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, like we said, I mean, Texas isn't playing at Vanderbilt. Oklahoma's not playing at Vanderbilt. All these other different ones, and of course, like I said, we can apply that to others. I mean, Texas probably not going to Kentucky. Oklahoma's not going there. Some of the others. I mean, and again, the natural ones, right? Like Texas and Missouri and Texas A&M aren't playing, and now you've got all these different scenarios. But yeah, like the ones, let's say that again are trying to have that fight back up. I mean, I think you probably put South Carolina in that category in terms of football too now, to where you're probably not going to see Clemson or never mind, I say Clemson, right? Of course you're going to see Clemson in South Carolina because they already play. Texas and Oklahoma, that's one. You're probably not going to have that opportunity. So it is something, and again, I think that. That's the fascinating part. Is like behind closed doors. I'm sure there are so many different things being said at a lot of different schools, and there are probably a lot of different opinions on all this. But at the end of the day, you know what? Everyone's probably going to make a lot more money, and I think a lot of people are probably going to be okay with that, just in terms of what this could eventually look like. We already know, what's official now with Texas and Oklahoma, but what this thing could eventually look like for schools and revenue, and we said this like. Think about what the past year and a half has brought about, and a lot of schools are probably taking a hard look at things like revenue and that kind of stuff. This is going to add a lot of that in terms of the potential that you could get from this kind of setup.
Okay, I just had a wild thought because this is the season for wild thoughts. Okay, in the NFL, what do you see now? You see Thursday games, you see Monday night games. Sometimes you see two Monday night games. If there is an agreement between the ACC and the SEC, I think obviously
Yeah,
ESPN or TV, whoever has those contracts, is going to have a big say in what happens. That's my next question: is what does that do to the TV schedule, game times? Are we going to see more Thursday night type games, maybe even a Friday night game? Now, I don't think that's likely
yeah,
because that interferes with coaches'
yeah,
abilities to get on the road and see games and that sort of thing. And where I think this falls apart is who is the rights owner for Monday Night Football right now. Well, it's ESPN, which is going to control this. But it is interesting to try to think about how this could affect football scheduling as it pertains to TV.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's the scenario where you would. I mean, I would imagine you've got more than just the Saturday games. Like you could play multiple games on Thursday night. Kind of be in that situation. I think to be able to do that. I was just thinking too. What CBS? They're not going to have the SEC, right? What was I'm trying to think of that. I don't know why I can't
I
think of this.
believe that game's going to ESPN, is it not?
That's what I was thinking. I had a feeling it was like it had to be ESPN, right? So like that's another one where it's like, man, if you're CBS, you're thinking, my goodness, wish we add a few more dollars in there to get that, because that would be. I mean, you think of the spectacle there now with adding Texas and Oklahoma, but I think you would in that scheduling setup. I feel like you'd have to, because you couldn't play them all on Saturday, right? Like again, if let's say now look with a 16 team, sure you could, but if it eventually expanded to like a 32. I don't think you'd want all your games just on that Saturday. I feel like because again, there's only so many hours, right? You're not going to be spreading them out throughout that. I feel like for visibility purposes, you want to give a little more even as you can. But then it comes into, all right, there's some scheduling hassles with that too. If you have multiple games on a Thursday night, all right, well, those teams, what's their layoff until the next game? Like it's just, I think that's why I wouldn't take that job because it's probably very difficult. But I feel like that's how you would have to do it. I feel like Thursday, Saturday would probably be your best way to do it in that scenario, perhaps. But then again, I mean, look, the NFL, they have games on, Thursday nights too, and that's a tough thing. You really want to go, even the worst NFL games probably going to draw pretty good ratings. And so I think a lot of that, certainly still to be determined, I think, with how they would do that. And like you said, I don't think there's any way they're doing anything on Friday. Because in Texas, high school football just perhaps pretty on a high scale too, as it is everywhere. I think certainly in SEC country.
I think we have found the blueprint for how ESPN the Ocho becomes reality.
Well, they may not have a choice. We may be calling games at some point because I mean they're going to need a lot of commentary teams if they go to 32. So we don't have any plans to exit or anything, but Listen, if we need to start live streaming games on our YouTube channel or something, we'll do that.
Well, I do wonder because the inventory of games is going to be an issue, and it's a good issue. But like you said, I have to think that you'll start seeing more of these games played on different days. I also wonder if you might not see the double bye come back under that scenario
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think
because
about
that
that.
spreads out your inventory a little bit more. Well, that because once you start playing on Tuesdays and Thursdays, if you're playing back to back weeks, that gets really hard to do. I mean, in the NFL, it's hard enough already, but you're adding class and all those things to that too. And so that is the other thing that I wonder if that comes back into play.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. That's there's so many different things like that that probably when we stop talking, we're say, "Oh, we forgot about those 18 things we probably could have mentioned with this whole scenario." It's just like things just keep popping up, and you're like, "My goodness, this is it's something like it changes the game completely." And as we said, this could just be the first step in doing that.
Well, and look, it seems to me the logical step if the ACC and the SEC have some sort of a merger or agreement or whatever language we attach to that, don't the Big Ten and the Pac-12 have to team up in their own way?
Yeah, I mean that's where you're fighting an uphill battle already. I mean, at that point, you've got to you're like, all right, we can either go down individually or we can team up and try to figure out how to make this work to combat the problems, especially like we said in college football is going to be the big one. But yeah, it's there's a lot to figure out. And I think for other conferences now, like we said, we're not even talking about just the teams in the Big 12. We've got a lot to figure out, but these other conferences too. Once they start to look at this scenario and even in the scenario as it stands now with Texas and Oklahoma joining, that's not even to mention the potential 32 team system. If you're the ACC would be fine, but whew, the others would have a lot to figure out.
Well, and then the question is, what does TV look like for those two leagues? I mean, that's got a Fox heavy
My
presence,
goodness,
I
yeah,
think, and each league's got its own network, but they're so far behind the SEC. Well, maybe not the Big Ten as much, but the Pac-12 for sure, where the passion for this just isn't anything close to what you see in the SEC. And I do wonder. Now, the Big Ten, I don't think that's as big of an issue right now. Pro sports might be more on the minds of folks up there proportionally as compared to the SEC, but the Pac-12, look, those schools in their own media markets are non-entities, and so that's the league to me that I'm very interested to see where this goes for the Pac-12.
yeah. They're gonna have the Pac-12 after dark going for them, but it may be a challenge to, like we said, in terms of just the I don't know, like just trying to figure out a path to knowing again if we're looking at this just from a college football standpoint. Ooh, that path to trying to be able to, combat what you're going to have in the SEC, and again, that path to the playoff or whatever that looks like. There's a lot of things I think in that scenario you got to figure out. But I think for us too, right? Let's say it goes to 32 teams, we're going to have to hire a whole football team to be able to cover all these games. So how are we going to cover all these games every Saturday? It's going to be you and I aren't going to sleep. So
What's your email address again so where people can apply for jobs here?
oh goodness, I'm not doing that. Not yet. We're gonna wait for the 32 team to be official. We're okay with still 16, but if it gets to 32, we're gonna be we having to hand out something to get people to come in and help us. So
This was a wonderful year to start a website and build your branding
unbelievable.
around the number 14.
Who came up with that idea? Oh yeah.
Yeah,
I
you're
don't. I don't
speaking
want to. I
to
don't want to say who that was. My
right.
goodness, who was the guy that sat back and said, "Hey guys, what if we put the number in there? How different and cool would that be?" My goodness. Oh boy.
It's just a number. Numbers don't matter anymore. You can ask the Big Ten about that.
Yeah, that's true. I guess that's a good point. So
Well, and the other thing of this is I know it doesn't get talked about much, but the non-power 5 leagues now, I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I don't think they stop playing football, but maybe the way we have it now where every SEC team basically plays either the first weekend or that one dead weekend in November that we all hate so much. Maybe instead of playing an FCS team, you're playing Marshall or someone like that. You get your one
yeah,
non-Power 5 game of the year. Again, because TV is going to dictate all this. And frankly, those games aren't really compelling matchups anyway from a network standpoint. I mean, unless you get an Appalachian State and a Michigan. Even then, nobody knows to watch that ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
To me, I'm interested to see how that affects things. But then the cards that those leagues have is they're like, hey, wait a minute. You can't have the NCAA basketball tournament the way it is and the way that everybody loves it without us. So I do wonder, maybe it's pissing in the wind, excuse my language, but
Yeah.
I do wonder if the trump card those leagues have is the NCAA tournament, because people tune in to watch that as much to see those teams in a lot of ways, at least the first weekend, as they do to see Kansas.
I was gonna say, like, I don't, that's the one concern I have is when it comes to the NCAA tournament, and we've talked about this a little bit. Um, I don't want it to get it to the point to where we're just like, all right, we're just gonna have a couple mega conferences, and those teams are gonna play in a 64 team. And I know, some people would be for that. I am not. I would rather, I think we've made progress on the mid major front, right, over the past decade or so. And I feel like this would just be a huge step back. But like I said too, you know what? I say all this doesn't matter. Like, they're gonna, if it's gonna make more money, it doesn't matter what I think, and it doesn't matter about tradition and wanting to, keep it the way it is. Because even as big as the NCAA tournament is, if you do, let's say, add more power conference teams into it, it becomes just this giant tournament that's filled with, all basically power conference, all the top power conference teams. And of course, maybe you get your regular season or your tournament champions from all the others, but that's it. Like, you're not getting any sort of, at large bids from any of these other conferences. I just think that's a step backwards for me. But you know what? Given the amount of interest from the fan bases, from the power conference schools, or whatever the landscape looks like, there's probably going to be more people watching. And at the end of the day, that's probably all they care about. So,
Well, and let's try this on for size. What if you have a 64 team tournament? Obviously, it would not be the NCAA tournament
yeah.
anymore because the NCAA wouldn't exist in that. But you have a for lack of a better term, Power Five. It wouldn't be the Power Five, but Power Four, whatever name you want to
Yeah.
attach to it. You have a 64 team tournament where all the teams play. Which, by the way, boy, you talk about diluting your regular
Mm,
season. That
yeah.
would do that. But if you like to see the team with the 16 and the 15 win games, you don't want to have the same feel
Yeah.
as if it's Charleston Southern. But you get my drift. You'll see a lot more upsets, I think, in that format.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, I just, for example, let's say, I don't know, let's just take a random situation. I mean, we're not picking on Vanderbilt, but they've been towards the bottom of the SEC in recent years. Like, if Vanderbilt's a 16 and playing, I don't know, a Kansas or a Michigan, or, yes, like, it'd be huge for the Vanderbilt fans and that kind of thing. But, it's much different than if it's UMBC, right? Upsetting Virginia and those kind of things. And like I said, I don't know. I don't feel optimistic on that part that we're going to necessarily keep that part of it intact. But I would hate it if it's not, just because, again, I think that there has been a lot of progress made from the point of actually being more respectable to the mid-major programs that are really, really good, and giving them more opportunities in the NCAA tournament. But I also know that those numbers matter from a viewership standpoint and all those other things. And if you have bigger schools with bigger fan bases that are going to watch more, well, that's they'll take the money and and go with it. So,
Okay, try this on for size. What if you take the 64 teams that are left standing, if this all goes down the way a lot of folks think it's going to, and you make the NCAA basketball tournament like you make the NCAA baseball tournament?
yeah,
You get 16
you can do that.
hosts, you seed them all 1 to 4, and it's a double elimination tournament. And then you play it out just like they do in baseball. And maybe instead
Yeah.
of a Final Four, you have a College World Series type format with 8 teams, and it's double elimination. That becomes, well, you talk about something you could sell for TV.
Yeah. No, that there's a lot more appeal in that scenario, I think. Yeah, I mean, because that's like the baseball setup is very appealing. Like, because, although, like we said, you kind of, I don't know though, I don't want to say that it's not predictable, but like I think it offers a little bit more intrigue and unpredictability, which I think that's what the NCAA tournament, for at least the first couple rounds, that's what people want to see. It would be a little bit different, I guess. Of course, but like I said, I mean, everything's going to be different at this point, right? Like, everything's going to be different no matter what. So, yeah, there's a lot of things they have to consider, and I'm sure that's something that could be a possibility.
A baseball tournament like that would be brutal because
Yeah.
you don't get the 15-1 pass out over Prairie View on Friday night if you're Texas or Vanderbilt or Florida, right?
Yeah.
You get,
Be a
you
struggle.
know, right. It's going to be, especially with baseball becoming a much higher profile sport, and particularly the Big Ten has started to take it more seriously, all those sorts of things. It's not where basketball is, but you get the point. That would make that very interesting because you don't necessarily get that breeze game or those games where even the really good teams, and you see this happen in Omaha, those teams start to run out of pitching.
Yeah.
That gets to be a really compelling event where the dynamics of that completely change.
Yeah, it would be completely different on that front. Like you said, if you're if you became the national championship in that setup, you would really earn it because you would you play a lot of good teams. So
Well, I feel like we've gone over just about every element of this, gone all over the map, hit some crazy stuff that'll probably never happen. But Blake, let's end this today. And is there anything else that we didn't get to with this subject that you think warrants pointing out?
no, still just waiting for a Mike Leach quote. That's all I want now. I want to hear his thoughts. I want like 30 minutes just of Mike Leach just going on and on about this whole deal. That's I know we're gonna get that soon enough now that's official, but that's what I'm waiting for more than anything.
And Mike Leach, if you're listening, you're welcome to come on our podcast or our YouTube channel and give your opinions. We will not censor you, nor will we put a time limit on it.
Absolutely not. I also think Lane Kiffin would be an interesting one to get his thoughts on as well. Lane's got he's got good thoughts on everything. So someone else, and of course, I'm sure Saban will have plenty to say about it also. So
Let's get Mike Leach and Lane Kiffin on the same podcast. How about that?
that'd be quite an interesting dynamic there, I think.
That'll be your homework between now and next week.
All right, between that and trying to prepare for how we're going to cover a 32 team mega conference, got a lot to do over the next week or so.
Absolutely. Well, it's fun. It's an exciting time. It's a historic time. This is going to be a week that people are talking about 50 years from now, and we're anxious to see where it's going to go. Anyway, if you like what you hear here, subscribe to our podcast where you get your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at 14 Southeastern. Visit our website at southeastern14.com. At least 14's in there for now. We may end up changing that very soon. But in any case, thank you for listening to this episode of the 14. I'm Chris Lee. He's Blake Lovell. We'll see you again very soon.